The sound of the slap echoed louder in my memory than it ever did in that ballroom. Funny, isn't it? How a single moment can rewrite everything you thought you knew about the person lying next to you every night. My name is Alina Marsh, and 3 months ago I was still the woman who believed her marriage was simply quiet. Not broken, just quiet. I told myself that quiet was safe. I was wrong. It was a Friday evening in late spring, the kind where the air still carried a chill, but the flowers had already given up pretending winter might return. The Whitmore Foundation Gala. My husband Daniel's company sponsored it every year, and every year I stood beside him in a dress I didn't choose for myself, smiling at people I didn't care to know, holding a champagne glass I never drank from. I used to think that was just marriage, compromise, playing a role. I didn't know yet that I was the only one still playing by the old rules. Daniel and I had been married for 7 years. 7 years of Sunday dinners with his parents, 7 years of anniversaries where he'd forget the reservation and I'd pretend not to notice. 7 years of me folding myself smaller and smaller so there'd be more room for his ambition. He was a rising executive at Callaway Industries, sharp suits, sharper words, a smile that could close any deal. People loved him. I loved him too. Or at least, I loved the version of him I'd built in my head over all those years, brick by brick, ignoring every crack. That night, something in me had already started to shift. I just didn't have a name for it yet. I noticed her first by the way Daniel's eyes moved. Not lingered, moved. Quick, practiced, like a man checking his phone under a dinner table. A woman in a deep red dress near the bar, laughing at something one of the board members said, but her gaze kept drifting toward my husband, and his kept drifting back. I told myself I was imagining it. 7 years of marriage teaches you how to talk yourself out of your own instincts. "You okay?" Daniel asked, adjusting his cufflink, not really looking at me. "Fine," I said. The word felt like a stone in my mouth. We mingled. We smiled. I shook hands with men whose names I forgot as soon as they let go. And every few minutes I felt it again, that pull in my chest, that quiet alarm bell I'd been silencing for years. I watched the woman in red. I watched how she touched Daniel's arm when she passed him near the dessert table, how her fingers lingered just a second too long, how he didn't step back. A friend of mine, Priya, from my book club, the only real friend I still had after years of being folded into Daniel's world, found me by the terrace doors. She didn't say hello. She just looked at me with an expression I still see when I close my eyes. "Alina," she said quietly, "you need to know something, and I don't know how to tell you gently, so I'm just going to say it." My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence. "That woman in red, her name is Vanessa Cole. She works in Daniel's division." Priya's voice dropped even lower. "Alina, I've seen them, at the Marchetti Hotel downtown, twice, maybe more." I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because some broken part of me thought if I laughed, it would stop being true. "You're wrong," I said. "Daniel wouldn't." But even as I said it, I was already turning to look for him. And that's when I saw them, Daniel and Vanessa, tucked into a corner near the east hallway, heads bent close together, her hand resting on his chest like it belonged there. Like it had been there before. Something in me went very still. The kind of stillness that comes right before everything shatters. I don't remember deciding to walk over. I just remember my heels against the marble floor, each step louder in my ears than the string quartet playing somewhere behind me. I remember the exact moment Vanessa noticed me first, her hand dropping from his chest a half second too late. "Daniel," my voice didn't sound like mine. "Who is this?" He turned, and for one terrible second I saw it not surprise, not guilt, irritation, like I was an inconvenience interrupting something important. "Alina, this isn't the time." "Then when is the time?" My hands were shaking. I hated that they were shaking. "Because Priya just told me something, and I need you to tell me it isn't true. Look at me and tell me it isn't true." Vanessa had the decency to look away. Daniel did not. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said, low, controlled, the same tone he used on underperforming employees. "We are not doing this here." "Then tell me we're not doing this anywhere," I said, and I heard my own voice crack. Tell me there's nothing to do. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I don't know what made me reach for his phone. Maybe it was 7 years of swallowed doubts finally rising up all at once, refusing to stay down any longer. It was sitting on the small cocktail table beside him, screen lit up with a message notification. I saw her name. I saw the message preview. I didn't even need to read the whole thing. 3 words were enough to end everything I thought I knew. Miss you already. I looked up at him, and something inside me simply broke, quietly, the kind of breaking no one around us could hear over the music. 7 years, I whispered. 7 years, Daniel. And that's when it happened. His hand moved before I even registered what was happening, fast, sharp, humiliating. The sound cracked through the air, cutting straight through the music, through the laughter, through every polite conversation happening around us. The room didn't just go quiet, it went frozen. I stood there, my cheek burning, not from pain exactly, from disbelief, from the sheer impossibility of it. This man I had built a decade of my life around, had just struck me in front of 200 people because I dared to ask him a question he didn't want to answer. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered against the floor, and I remember thinking, distantly, almost like I was watching myself from outside my own body. That glass sounds exactly like how I feel right now. Daniel's face went white the second he realized what he'd done, but it was too late. The damage wasn't just on my skin. It was in the eyes of every single person watching, in the silence pressing down on that ballroom like something physical. And then, from the back of the room, near the main entrance, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, footsteps that didn't rush because they didn't need to. I knew those footsteps before I even turned around. My father. Robert Hale, 71 years old, retired now, but once one of the most feared names in corporate law on the East Coast. A man who hadn't attended a single one of Daniel's company galas in 3 years because Daniel had made it clear, in his own quiet way, that my father's presence made him uncomfortable. Too observant, too sharp, too much like a man who noticed everything. I hadn't even known he was coming tonight. He walked through that crowd like the entire room belonged to him, and in some strange, terrifying way, it did. People stepped aside without being asked. His eyes found me first, found the mark still burning red on my cheek, and something passed across his face that I had only seen once before in my life, the day my mother died. Then his eyes moved to Daniel. "Robert," Daniel said, and for the first time all night, I heard something new in his voice. Fear. My father didn't answer him. He walked straight to me, gently took my chin in his hand, and turned my face toward the light, examining the mark like he was building a case, because in a way he was. Then he looked past me, at Daniel, at Vanessa still frozen by the cocktail table, at the 200 witnesses standing in horrified silence. And he smiled, a small, terrible, calm smile. "Daniel," my father said, his voice carrying easily across that silent room, "I don't believe you understand who you just did that in front of." Daniel opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. My father reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it with steady hands, hands that had signed contracts worth more than Daniel's entire career. "You should sit down," he said quietly, "because in about 10 minutes, your entire world is going to look very different." Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for the glass of water someone had placed in front of him, though he didn't drink it. He just held it, like it might anchor him to a moment that was already slipping out of his control. I stood there, my cheek still warm, watching my father type something into his phone with the same calm he used to bring to Sunday crossword puzzles. 200 people stood frozen around us, no one daring to leave, no one daring to speak. Vanessa had backed away toward the wall, her red dress suddenly looking less like elegance and more like a warning sign. "Robert, please," Daniel said, and I almost didn't recognize his voice. Gone was the polished executive tone. What replaced it sounded small. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, let's talk about this privately." My father looked up from his phone, and his expression was almost gentle. Almost. Privately, he said the word like he was tasting something bitter. You struck my daughter in front of 200 witnesses, Daniel. There is no more privacy to protect. You spent that currency the moment your hand touched her face. I felt Priya's hand find mine, squeezing gently. I hadn't even realized I was shaking until I felt how still her hand was compared to mine. Dad, I whispered, what are you doing? He didn't answer me directly. Instead, he turned slightly, addressing not just Daniel, but the room in that measured, unhurried way he used to address juries decades ago. Some of you know me, he said. Some of you don't. My name is Robert Hale. Many years ago, I represented the founding partners of Callaway Industries in a merger that made this company what it is today. He let that settle for a moment. I also happen to still sit quietly as a minority shareholder, something Daniel has known since the day he asked for my daughter's hand. The color drained further from Daniel's face. You're bluffing, Daniel said, but the words came out thin, unconvincing. Check your board notifications, my father said simply. I watched Daniel's hand fumble for his own phone. I watched his face as he read something, an email, a message. I never found out exactly what, and I watched 30 years of careful ambition crumble in real time across his features. You can't, Daniel said, his voice cracking. The merger clause includes a morality provision, my father finished for him. One your own legal team drafted, actually, to protect the company's public image after that scandal with your predecessor. I imagine they didn't picture it being used quite this way, but here we are. I didn't fully understand the business mechanics of what was happening. I didn't need to. What I understood was simpler, and it was this. My father hadn't come tonight for the gala. He hadn't come to see old colleagues or make small talk over champagne. He had come because some part of him, some quiet fatherly instinct, told him something was wrong long before I ever admitted it to myself. Alina, he said, turning back to me, his voice softening in a way that made my throat tighten. Do you want to leave? I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, the man I had spent 7 years trying to understand, trying to reach, trying to love enough for two people. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not the sharp suits, not the charming smile he wore like armor. Just a man who had never once, in all our years together, looked at me the way he'd looked at Vanessa's message on his phone. Yes, I said, my voice didn't shake this time. I want to leave. We didn't leave immediately, though. Not really. There were still things that needed to be said, even if I wasn't the one saying most of them. My father turned back to Daniel one final time. You have until Monday morning to submit your resignation from the board. If you don't, I will personally walk the footage from tonight. And there is footage, Daniel. Half this room was filming on their phones before I even arrived, into every major outlet that covers this industry. Your choice. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out that mattered. I turned to Vanessa before we left. I didn't feel rage looking at her, not really. I felt something closer to pity. She was younger than me, maybe by 6 or 7 years, and there was something in her face, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, that told me she hadn't fully understood what she was stepping into either. I hope it was worth it, I said quietly, and then I let my father guide me toward the exit, past the frozen crowd, past the string quartet that had stopped playing somewhere in the middle of all this without anyone noticing exactly when. The weeks that followed moved strangely, too fast in some ways, painfully slow in others. Daniel tried calling. He tried texting. Somewhere around the 11th unanswered message, the tone shifted from apologetic to desperate, then finally to something colder, almost threatening, before going silent altogether once his lawyer advised him that anything he said could be used in the divorce proceedings my father's firm had already begun drafting before I'd even asked him to. I moved back into my father's house for a while. Not because I needed rescuing. I was 34 years old. I had my own savings, my own resources. But because I needed, for the first time in 7 years, to be somewhere that didn't feel like it was built around someone else's expectations. Priya visited often. She'd bring wine we barely drank and sit with me on the back porch while I cried, or didn't cry, or just stared at nothing for long stretches of silence that she never once rushed me out of. "You knew for a while, didn't you?" I asked her one evening. "Before you told me." She was quiet for a moment. "A few weeks." I kept trying to find the right way to say it. "There isn't one. I'm sorry it took me so long." "No," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice came out. "I'm glad you finally did." The divorce itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the night it began. Daniel didn't fight much. He couldn't afford to, not with the board threatening to remove him entirely if the proceedings dragged into public view. I got the house we'd bought together in the second year of our marriage. He got to keep whatever was left of the reputation he'd spent so carefully building, though I heard, secondhand, through people who still moved in those circles, that it never quite recovered. People remember a slap. People remember silence in a room full of witnesses far longer than they remember an apology. Vanessa left the company 3 months later. I don't know if it was her choice or not, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't care enough to find out. My father never brought up that night again, not directly. But sometimes, when we'd sit together for Sunday dinner, just the two of us now, he'd look at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between pride and grief, and I understood, without either of us needing to say it out loud, exactly what that expression meant. I think about that ballroom sometimes. Not the slap, strangely. That memory has softened at the edges, the way sharp things do with enough time. What I remember most clearly is the silence right before my father's footsteps started. That terrible, suffocating silence, where I genuinely believed, for just a few seconds, that I was completely alone in that room. I wasn't. I don't think we ever really are, even when it feels that way. It's been almost a year now since that night. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college, something Daniel used to gently discourage, calling it a nice hobby in a tone that made it sound like anything but. My studio, a small converted room at the back of the house I kept, smells like turpentine in quiet mornings, and some days that's the only sound I need. Just brushes against canvas, and my own breathing, steady, unhurried mine. Priya asked me recently if I'd ever trust anyone again. I told her the truth. I don't know yet, but I know this much. I know what silence sounds like when it's hiding something, and I know what silence sounds like when it's simply peace. For 7 years, I mistook one for the other. I don't anymore. Some nights when the house is quiet and the only light on is the small lamp beside my bed, I think about the version of myself that stood in that ballroom, cheek burning, hands shaking, still hoping, even then, even after everything, that he'd tell me it wasn't true. I'm grateful, in a strange, complicated way, that he never got the chance to lie to me again. Because somewhere in that silence, in that terrible, frozen moment before my father's footsteps broke through it, I finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell me my life was worth protecting. I started protecting it myself.